Hello, this is Everybody Settle Down. I'm Charlie Marlow. That is the great Eric Messersmith. And we got some news, Eric. Kamala Harris is going to win the election, according to Allan Lichtman. I think this is very interesting. I was actually looking forward to his prediction when it came out. I've been following this guy for the last several months. I've known of him for years. So how are you doing? And let's get right into this prediction from Allan Lichtman, because I think it's going to be trending for the next couple of days here. This guy, basically, he's either 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 in predicting presidential winners. We'll get to the 9 out of 10, but this guy is usually right, Eric.
Yeah, he has his 13 keys for predicting the presidency. He's a political science guy, and he developed it back in the 80s. I think 84 was his first
Mhm.
election that he predicted. And basically, they're true false questions. And if enough of them are true, then the incumbent party in his prediction model wins. And if a certain number are false, then the challenger wins. Well, according to his model, Kamala Harris will win the presidency. And they're based on things like foreign policy, economics. Is the incumbent party running? Is there a third party? Those kind of things that you could plug into any election and that aren't specific to the time that you're in. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I like the guy. He's kind of quirky and funny, and he clearly has thought a lot about this. And I've looked at the keys, and they do make a lot of sense in terms of giving you a general big picture of where things are. And look, the track record speaks for itself. Either 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, depending on how you count 2000, which was essentially a tie. So if you remove that election from the sample set, he's 9 for 9. And I think there is merit to it in kind of taking that approach and looking back at what tends to matter to people in terms of picking a president. Now, I will say, I think it's worth noting that he didn't make an official prediction when Biden was in, but when Biden was the candidate, Biden was ahead on the keys and looked very likely that that was going to be his pick, even though I think most of us thought had Biden stayed in, the odds were overwhelmingly high that he would lose. So I do think that is interesting. Uh, my preferred method would be to go with polling and data over over the keys, but I do think there is some value in an academic approach that is grounded in kind of these big picture concepts of what tends to matter to the electorate.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned polling, and we're going to get to the polling. But because I've become an Alan Lichtman nerd over the last several months, I watch his shows a lot on YouTube here with his son. They're very funny. They have a very funny dynamic. It's kind of the boomer and the millennial. They poke fun at each other. So I would recommend everybody check out Alan Lichtman's channel on YouTube. He's really blown up on YouTube the last several months for this election cycle. You bring up polling, and I've chuckled when he's said this because you and I both, Eric, fortunately or unfortunately, have a history in sports talk radio. And Alan Lichtman, one of his phrases he always says is that polling doesn't matter. Polling is sports talk radio. He says polling is sports talk radio for politics. It gives you something to talk about every day. Oh, look, Kamala's up 3 points. The next day, Trump's up two. And it's kind of funny, and I get it. What he's saying is the day-to-day polling doesn't matter as much as these big concrete, foreign policy, economy. Are you the incumbent? Are you charismatic? And I'll throw it to you off that. What do you think, first of all, about his idea that the polling doesn't really matter? To him, polling is sports talk radio. It's just a bunch of, and hey, sports talk radio like I do. It's a bunch of gas bags.
Yeah.
It's a bunch of gas bags that don't really watch the games, that always have hot takes, and they don't really know what they're talking about. And I'm including myself in that.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. I think Nate Silver, who I am a huge Nate Silver nerd, he's kind of one of the pioneers of what I would consider to be modern election modeling. He did it at 538. He now has his own on the Silver Bulletin. 538 still does their own separate from him. There are other forecasts now that The Economist has one, The Hill has one, so it's become more popular. And they're based mainly on polling, although there are other factors as well that go into their methods. And that kind of is the main. He has gone back and forth with Lichtman on
Yes.
X. Nate Silver has, and
For
essentially
years.
when Biden was in the race and Lichtman was predicting, it looked like he didn't make an official prediction, but he was saying based on his keys, Biden was in good position. In fact, Lichtman said Biden should not drop out. It would be a huge error for the Democrats, because essentially what he said is, based on my keys, Biden has this one. Well, look, if you believe that, to me, you lose some credibility there, because then what you're saying is you are so tied to this system and this format that you are unable to see what is clearly right in front of your face, which is Biden was a clearly diminished candidate who was likely, I say likely, to lose, because you never know. Had Biden stayed in, there were 3 months left, anything could happen, right? But that to me is a tell that if you're so blinded by your model, you can't see the clear data right in front of you. You tend to lose some credibility in my mind. But when they were going back and forth, when Biden was in the race, Silver's model was showing Trump was a clear favorite. And so Silver said, hey, I'll bet you, I forget the exact money he threw out, but it was like 700 grand or something, or 500. I'll bet you like an obscene amount of money, or any money you want. So essentially what Nate Silver was saying is, hey, if you think your model is so good and so accurate and better than the polling based models like mine, then let's put real money on the table. Put up money, right? Because it's one thing to make predictions. Anybody can make, I consider and make a million predictions in the world. But as you know, as someone who, again, and this is where sports comes in, betting markets, and we talk about this with elections, it's true with sports as well, they are the great equalizer, because then it's not about what do I feel, what do I think, it's who is putting money on the line. And that was Nate Silver's point, is if you think your model's so good, let's bet. And I actually went back and read, Silver had done an article years earlier when he was at 538, where he actually went back, and because Lichtman is not the only academic who does these. These are done over the last 30 or 40 years by numerous academics using all kinds of different models. And Silver went back and did a pretty extensive look at those. And what he found was they didn't do a good job, that they were not any more or less accurate than you would expect basically anybody to be. Now, I will say Lichtman is an exception, because he is incredibly accurate, either 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, depending on how you count the 2000 election. So I give him more credibility, because he clearly, when he developed this, did a ton of research. He's a historian, and he used that to inform his model, and it is held up to a pretty rigorous degree. And look, 2016, he was right. He picked Trump. The polling showed you that Hillary was going to win. Now, I think it's, again, this is where it gets complicated. The polling was for the popular vote, and Hillary Clinton did in fact win the popular vote. Lichtman predicted the winner of the Electoral College correctly, which was Donald Trump. So Nate Silver's model had Trump at about a 30% chance of winning in 2016. And of course, he lost. So if you were judging 2016, you would judge Silver wrong, Lichtman correct, right? Which is true. That is a fact. But I think what Nate Silver, the reason I like him, I think more than I do Lichtman, is because Silver is about probability, right? Lichtman is essentially saying, well, there's a 100% chance Kamala Harris wins now, because I predicted it. My formula shows me. I think that's crazy. I think this election is much closer to 50-50. I also think it's crazy that his model told him that Joe Biden was likely to win at a point where Biden had like probably a 20 or 30% chance of winning, and Trump was the clear favorite. So I side more on the polling probability side. But here's the key. You have to recognize that polling and election models and betting markets are probability, not certainty. There is no certainty in life, and there certainly isn't certainty in politics. And so when people say there's a 60% chance of something happening, that means it's more likely than not, but that's not a great probability, and it sure as hell isn't 100%. And so when you're looking at polling and election forecasts based primarily on polling, you always have to understand that in your mind. But again, I go back to what happened a couple months ago. If you are so tied to a model that you think Joe Biden was going to win that election a few months ago after that debate because your model said so, I think you're too tied to the model, and I think you're not looking at it from a realistic standpoint. But by just here are his 13 keys. And again, I want to be clear. I think these are pretty good. If you were going to develop a model that didn't include polling, which I think would be dumb, but if you were going to do it, this is the way you should do it. Here are his 13 keys. The White House party gained seats in the House in midterm elections. The incumbent president is running. The White House party avoided a primary contest. A third party candidate is running. The short-term economy is strong. The growth of the long-term economy has been as strong as last 2 terms. The White House has enacted major national policy changes. There is no social unrest. There is no scandal in the White House. The incumbent party candidate has charisma. The challenger is uncharismatic. The White House had foreign policy success. The White House had foreign policy failures. If you were going to do like generic things that could apply to any election, those are pretty good. Now, as you probably are thinking as I'm reading them, there is some degree of vagueness in assigning a true false rating to each of those keys, right? Like there is, and he, to his credit, again, if you watch his videos, he has very strict criteria on a lot of these for what classifies as a third party candidate, what classifies as avoiding a primary contest. He does have some hard numbers there, which I think are good. It's not so much about vague assertions, but on some of them, the challenger is uncharismatic. That's a judgment call, right? The incumbent party candidate has charisma. That's a judgment call to some degree. So I like what he's doing. I think it's way better than other academic models. I give him a lot of credence and credibility for it, but I prefer forecasts based on actual polling data, which tends to be over the long haul pretty accurate.
Couple things on that. First of all, go to the third party candidate. You know, we like to talk about RFK Jr. on this show. I believe, and people correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the third party has to get more than 5%, or maybe it's 10%.
Yes. No, it's
whatever.
In his model, it's 5%. For his
Okay.
key to be true, the third
Right.
party candidate has to get 5% or more.
You know, it might be 10. Is you sure it's 5? We'll look that up. Either way.
I think I heard him say 5 once, but I could be wrong
Okay.
on that.
Couple things on his keys. And again, I've watched and listened to him so much here that I probably know too much. But like the charisma key. In his mind, Donald Trump is not one of those charismatic figures like a John F. Kennedy, like a Barack Obama. And when you listen to him talk, I think you'll agree. Now, I think Donald Trump as the leader of a movement, I think he has charisma. I think his followers really love him. So I understand how people would say, well, Donald Trump is very charismatic. But you also have to look at the data and basically say, for as charismatic as Donald Trump is, he still has a high floor, but a very low ceiling, right? Like he's not somebody that is bringing a bunch of new people into the tent. And so that's how Allan Lichtman looks at the angle for charisma. And then the other thing with RFK Jr. is it's kind of interesting because if the third party candidate were to get the big percentage, right, and that hurts the incumbent president, but you could make the argument that in this particular election, it would have hurt Donald Trump. And then the fact that you have this third party candidate who I do think is pretty popular in RFK Jr., but then he endorses Donald Trump. So that's just really interesting there. Take that for what it's worth. And then maybe we'll finish on Lichtman here because again, I've watched so much of his content. He says he's 10 out of 10 on the predictions because he says Al Gore actually won in 2000. And he has a lot of evidence that backs this up. Again, you can go and watch all of this. He basically says there was a hugely disparate number of African-American ballots that were thrown out in the state of Florida. So he actually says, no, he was right. The wrong person won the presidency in 2000, meaning Al Gore should have been the winner. Again, that's his opinion. So don't yell at me. Go ahead and watch all of
Right.
his videos on this, which he's been doing for 24 years, talking about this, by the way, and he has a lot of data to back it up.
Yeah.
I bring this up though because I think it's interesting. Look, the right and the Trump folks think every election is stolen. Okay? And then on the left, let's say Donald Trump wins. So Allan Lichtman is again wrong. But let's say there's some similar hijinks, I'll call it, to 2000 in Florida. Let's say that in one particular swing state, let's say it's Pennsylvania, for example. I think we both agree that Pennsylvania will probably swing this election. What if Trump wins, but then we find out that for whatever reason, there were folks that were no longer on the voter rolls or ballots were thrown out? When I was watching this today, I watched a video of Lichtman talking about 2000. And I just started to chuckle because I go, what if this is the other time he's wrong,
Yeah.
but it's because of some hijinks? And I'm not this person that says elections are stolen and all that. But the Florida 2000 thing was really odd because it came down to one state and something like 538 votes or 537 votes in one state. Al Gore won the popular vote, and there was a lot of craziness with the hanging chads and all that. I only bring
Yeah.
this up because, Eric, this is such a crazy year for politics. I feel like with everything that's gone on, with Biden dropping out, with Trump and the assassination attempt, with Kamala jumping in, like this would be the year where, again, like 2000, something weird like that happens. If it's going to ever
Yeah.
happen, it's going to be this year, Eric.
Well, that's the problem with the basis of his election model is it doesn't take into account the weirdness. Like I said, he had Biden as an incumbent staying in the race counting as a positive, which normally it would probably be a positive, an incumbent running for re-election, not when that incumbent can't string a sentence together in a debate. So his model was just wrong, counting that as a positive. It wasn't a positive. It was a positive, actually, that Biden got out of the race. Same thing with the RFK Jr. thing. When Biden was in the race, it was true that RFK Jr. was bad for Biden, right? So he would have been right. But when Kamala Harris got in the race, we see in the polling, it was pretty clear that RFK Jr. was helping Harris. So again, his key would have been completely wrong had RFK Jr. stayed in. Rather than RFK Jr. helping the incumbent, he would have been hurting the incumbent. So my point is that that's why the model is flawed. In terms of 2000, look, 2000, the right way to score that is a draw. That should not count as he got 2000 right or wrong because it was a tie. Our system isn't built to measure tie elections. If every vote counted as it was intended, Al Gore probably would have won. He's probably right on that. There was a butterfly ballot design in Broward County where lots of people voted for Pat Buchanan, who was running as an independent, way more than he got anywhere else. And it was because, clearly, if you saw the design of the ballot, people were confused because Gore and Buchanan's names were so close to each other and they voted for the wrong candidate. That's what happened. So I think Bush probably did win based on how the ballots were cast, but I think Gore would have won based on what voters intended. It was a tie. Now, in terms of going forward, you're right. Like shenanigans, not certifying votes, disputing who's on the voter rolls. If it's close, I think we could see 2000 levels of lawyers looking over the shoulders of vote counters. But it gets back to kind of another thing that factors into these models, both Lichtman's model and also the polling models, is the difference between the Electoral College and the popular vote. In most of American history, that hasn't mattered. Usually the same candidate wins both. But we've had two examples in the last, 5 elections? Two out of the last 6 elections. The party that won the popular vote didn't win the electoral vote. And it's possible that happens again because I think Kamala Harris is very likely to win the popular vote. Not certain, but very likely. But she is definitely not at all very likely to win the Electoral College. That's more like 50-50, right? And the reason is because Republicans have an advantage in Electoral College. And think about what that does. I understand the people who argue for the Electoral College. It is what our founding fathers settled on. although they settled on lots of other things like the 3/5 compromise and senators not being directly elected. And they had to make a lot of compromises to bring all the factions together in the 1780s, right? If you were starting from scratch, you would never design the Electoral College. I mean, it's in many ways insane. And what it does, not only does it distort the will of the majority in a democracy, but it does it in a way, and this is my biggest problem with it, it does it in a way that sets us up for the kinds of things that happened in 2000 and may happen this year, where you could have, like, it wouldn't matter that much about shenanigans by local elected officials if you had a popular vote, right? We wouldn't have to worry about fake electors because there would be no electors. We wouldn't have to worry about unfaithful electors, which has happened a lot in American history.
Hold on.
Where a candidate
that's people that cheat on their spouses or what?
Yes, that is people. No, that are elected. Those are electors who defy the will of their state. So their state votes for candidate A, and the electors say, "No, I'm good. I'm going to vote for candidate B or for another candidate altogether." If you go back to 2016, it didn't matter. It didn't change the result, but there were like 5 or 6 electors who voted for somebody other than Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, even though they were bound by the results of their state to vote for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Now, some states have instituted rules to try to force electors to vote the way they want. So it's unlikely it matters. But the fact that it's even a possibility is insane. The fact that you wouldn't have even needed to certify the electors if you didn't have an electoral college. There wouldn't have been a January 6th, right? It may have happened on a different day, but it wouldn't have happened that day. The reason it happened that day was because Congress was certifying the electors. And so my point is, having the Electoral College, whether you believe it's the best system or not, it sets us up for all of these different arcane roles that different states and different local jurisdictions have in how they count votes, and makes it so that if there is a candidate or a party that wants to try to change an election result, they've got a lot of different levers and mechanisms that they wouldn't have if the Electoral College didn't exist.
Okay, let's get to the sports talk radio, which is the polling and the betting odds. And we've seen that for the last week to 2 weeks in the betting odds, there was that time where, so this was right before the Democrat convention and right before the RFK endorsement. I want to say Kamala Harris was up about 10 percentage points. And I'm talking about percentage points in the betting odds on Donald Trump. It was something like, I don't know, 50, 54, 44, something like that. Then I think because of the idea of RFK is going to drop out, he is going to endorse Trump, we started to see it kind of go towards Trump. Maybe there was a little bit of a bounce for Kamala for the DNC, but then that next day, RFK makes his announcement officially, and there's the speech and all that. And so I'll hold it up here for everybody. As of right now, Donald Trump, 50.1% chance of winning. Kamala, 47.7%. Let's just go ahead and say it's a 2.5% lead for Donald Trump. But all of the charisma and the bounce and the joy of Kamala Harris, right? Since the announcement, that has now seemed to dissipate in the betting odds. And we basically have a 50-50, or whatever you want to call this, 50-48 Trump lead right now.
I actually think I would rather be Harris right now than Trump, but it's really close. And the reason it's close is because of what I just talked about. Harris is ahead by an average of 2 to 4 points nationally, depending on what polling average you look at. I think she's very likely to win the popular vote. But Trump maintains the same thing he had in 2016 and 2020, which is a fairly strong advantage in the Electoral College. And that is what is driving this, is the swing states are so close. CNN polling of swing states this week. Trump up 5 in Arizona and Kamala up 5 in Michigan. Harris is ahead by 6 in Wisconsin. Pretty good. But here is why Trump is still a slight favorite. Harris is only up by 1 in Georgia, She's up by 1 in Nevada, and they're tied in Pennsylvania. So let's assume that Harris wins Michigan and Wisconsin, and let's assume Trump wins Arizona. Maybe not, but I think if you were to bet today, you'd probably bet that way for those 3 states. What's that leave us with? Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Here's why Trump's betting odds have improved. Harris, in that scenario, has to win either Pennsylvania, Georgia, or North Carolina. She's got to win one of those 3. Has to. Trump is probably slightly ahead in North Carolina and Georgia, although it's very close, and Pennsylvania is essentially tied. And that is what a lot of this comes down to, is Pennsylvania. Harris's numbers in Pennsylvania were looking better a few weeks ago. Right now, Nate Silver on his polling average has Harris up by 1 in Pennsylvania. 1 point. That's essentially a tie. And if she doesn't win Pennsylvania, it's going to be so hard. Pre-convention, Nate Silver had Harris up 1.8 in Pennsylvania. Now he has her up 1. He had pre-convention Harris up 3.1 in Michigan, now up 1.9. So again, she's still up, but it's so close. And she didn't get, it appears, the DNC bounce. Even though I thought the convention went well, you and I talked about the speech. I thought it was very good. There really isn't a bounce that's shown up in the polling. And if anything, Trump has actually very slightly improved his polling position since the DNC. Now, huge caveat here. There has not been, I think because Labor Day came right after the long Labor Day weekend, right after the debate or the convention, we have not seen a ton of polling that happened all post-convention. I think we'll get a lot more end of this week heading into the debate coming up next week. But from what we've seen, Charlie, there's very little, if any, post-convention bounce. And if anything, it's gone a little bit in Trump's direction. But I just want to be so clear about Pennsylvania being everything. If Harris gets a poll or several polls in the next week or two that show her up 2, 3, 4 points in Pennsylvania, the numbers are going to bounce up for Harris, I think, significantly. Pennsylvania, as each day goes by, looks more and more like it's going to decide this thing. And I just go back again to Josh Shapiro. Again, maybe it won't matter, but you had the sitting governor with a 60% approval rating. And if he gives you half a point or a point in Pennsylvania, I mean, that literally could decide this whole thing.
Yeah, I was trying to find this graphic here that I had seen in the last couple days. And we can talk all day long about it probably coming down to Pennsylvania, which it most likely will. But I was reading this kind of graphic about Trump's strategy for spending in different states. And even though I think it's fair to say Trump and the Republicans have an advantage in the Electoral College, it also basically came down to Trump knows that he has to win Pennsylvania so much to win that they might be putting too many resources into Pennsylvania and then potentially. So the strategy makes sense, but it's so high risk, high reward, because then if you lose anything else, like a Georgia, like a combination, and we can do the math, but like a combination of North Carolina, Nevada, whatever it is, essentially, this is a long way of saying, like, if Trump doesn't win Pennsylvania, he's done. He's just done.
I think what has been, look, again, we are imagining a world where obviously this election is what it appears to be now, which is very close. It's possible one candidate or the other pulls away and this is a moot discussion, right? But if it stays roughly like it is now, it's becoming more and more clear that Pennsylvania is everything for both candidates. And the reason for that is because Georgia and North Carolina, which when Biden was in the race, they looked really solid for Trump. And North Carolina, especially, that was gone. That was basically off the map. They have been pulled back to the point, if you look at the recent polling, where they are roughly the same as Pennsylvania. So now you have Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania all kind of in the same bucket as essentially 50-50. And Trump, if he doesn't win Michigan and Wisconsin, he has to get all 3 of them. He has to have them all. He can't lose any. If he loses just one. So that is why now he's in that kind of pickle. But on the other side, Harris has to win one of them. Pennsylvania, Georgia, or North Carolina. Plus, if it's not Pennsylvania, she needs Nevada too. So that's why it's so critical to her. So the way that the polling has converged in these swing states, with North Carolina and Georgia getting closer to 50-50 and kind of in the same area of Pennsylvania, have made it so that Pennsylvania now becomes even more important than it looked like it was going to be. Because if it's close, Trump probably needs all three, a clean sweep. Harris needs either Pennsylvania or, if she doesn't get it, Georgia or North Carolina plus Nevada. And look, if it's close, that's what this is going to come down to, are those scenarios. That is where we're going to be, plus the 2nd congressional district of Nebraska. But that gets really, hairy. That looks like it's going to go blue.
Why do they even get that, by the way? It just makes no sense that Omaha gets their own little thing. It's just like, hey, it's been going on forever. Hey, it's fun. It's done.
Well,
By
again,
the way,
why? The answer is the Electoral College. If
right.
you didn't have an Electoral College, this wouldn't matter. But in Maine and Nebraska, they're the two states that give electoral votes based on statewide winner and congressional district. And Trump is going to, even though Harris is going to win Maine, Trump's probably going to win one of the Maine congressional districts and pick up an electoral vote there. And Harris is going to win, or I'm sorry, Trump's going to win Nebraska, but Harris is leading by about 5-6 points in that Omaha district that is likely to give her that electoral vote. Which, by the way, if the scenario plays out where she holds the blue wall, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, but Trump wins the Sun Belt states, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, then Harris would win 270 to 268 because of that Omaha, Nebraska congressional district. And in fact, in Omaha, they now have signs where it is just a blue dot. That's the sign. And obviously what it means is, in a sea of red, Omaha is that one blue dot that could give Kamala Harris the presidency. Again, why? Because of the Electoral College, baby.
And that's when you explain it like that, it's so hilarious. And by the way, I think the Electoral College is stupid. I think popular vote is better. I understand why right now any Republican is going to say, no, the Electoral College is great. I get it. Look, Democrats almost always win the popular vote. Republicans have a much better chance with the Electoral College. I understand it. I think most people would agree it's stupid, but it's even dumber. When you think about that, we are the greatest country in the world. We are trying to elect, Eric, the leader of the free world. So think about if you're over there in like Australia, France, somewhere in Asia, and you're like, here is the shining city on a hill. The United States of America is going to potentially nominate their president based on fucking Omaha, Nebraska.
Right.
Based home of the College World Series. It's so stupid. It's when you explain it, it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Based on a system designed in the 1780s. And look, I want to be clear, I'm a huge history nerd, and in particular, I love that time period. I just not too long ago read a book about Alexander Hamilton, who was the father, really, of the Constitution. I mean, he was, if you were to say who is the most influential person in drafting the Constitution, it was Hamilton. He actually wrote kind of the rough draft that they then used. But Hamilton didn't get his way all the time because he wanted a more majoritarian system. He was fighting for a more, but the small states and the slaveholding states were like, no way. That's why the Senate that's why Wyoming has as many senators as California, even though California has 40 million people and Wyoming has like 575,000. That is why we have the electoral. So I love the founding fathers. I think their system was incredible, especially given the time. But it was a product of the times, the compromises they had to make. Remember, when they did this, not only couldn't minorities vote, not only couldn't women vote, white men who didn't have property couldn't vote. It was a completely different world. But that system that came from that world is what we use 250 years later. It's really crazy. And getting back to what you said about the Republicans, you're right. They would never go for a change now. They have these all these arguments why we should have the Electoral College. But just imagine for a second that in the last 6 elections, 2 of them, as I said earlier, with a popular vote and Electoral College switch. Imagine if Republicans had lost both of those, right? So imagine in 2000, Bush wins the popular vote, but Gore wins the Electoral College. And in 2016, Trump wins the popular vote, but Hillary is the Electoral College. What arguments would Republicans be making then? They'd be making the exact opposite argument. They'd be saying, no, it's not fair. The majority is spoken. How can we have the... So both sides would be arguing the exact opposite of what they're arguing now. My point is just step back from the partisan politics of who you want to win and just think about the fairness of the system where Joe Biden got 7 million more votes than Donald Trump in 2020. Had a few less than 100,000 votes switched in 3 states, Trump would have been the president. I mean, is that fair that a guy who gets 7 million votes would have lost? What if he had won by 10 million or 15 million? Like, it gets absurd with the Electoral College if you kind of play out the examples. There's no way we would design this system if we were starting now. Look, my preference in an ideal world would be to have neither the Electoral College or the popular vote. My preference would be ranked choice voting, where you have 4 or 5 candidates, and then a majority candidate would emerge with ranked choice voting, because you would eliminate the person with the fewest votes. Their second choice then would be distributed. You would have a majority winner every time, but people could still vote their conscience and not worry about affecting the outcome. So RFK Jr., under a ranked choice system, could stay in the race. And he could say, vote for me. Just list Trump as your second choice. And then when he was eliminated, his second choice, so people could still vote for the candidate they wanted without affecting the result, and you would have a majority winner. But that's never going to happen in the presidency. I think it should. I think it would be the best system. I think it would incentivize moderate candidates to run. I think it would be best for our democracy. But it's not going to happen. I recognize that. So given the alternative, of course, it's more simple and fairer for the crazy thought, right? The majority to win. I mean, think about if you had a Senate race or a House race or a governor's race where we had a system where the candidate who got the most votes would lose. I mean, that would be crazy. We wouldn't do that for the Senate or the House or the governor, but we do it for literally the most important job in our country and in the world. It's crazy. And as I said earlier, the biggest argument against it now isn't even necessarily that it's the worst way to pick a president. It's that it sets up bad actors to have so many different choke points where they can try to overturn the result. It empowers local officials, some of whom are, let's be honest, partisan hacks. It gives them power in a way that they would never have if you had a popular vote. Like in 2020, if you had a popular vote and Joe Biden won by 7 million, Donald Trump and his people and Rudy Giuliani could complain all they want about, Dominion voting, changing votes, or illegals voting, or whatever crazy arguments they came up with. It wouldn't matter because the gap was so wide. We'd be like, oh, come on, it's 7 million votes. But because of the Electoral College, it allowed for all the shenanigans we saw in 2020, leading up to and including a rioter storming the Capitol to try to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power.
Couple things on that. It's kind of like the Supreme Court with term limits. I think most people would agree we should have term limits. We don't want 85-year-old justices dying. I bet you most Republicans in theory would agree with that, but they're not going to agree with it now because Trump put 3 about 55-year-old justices right up there on the bench who are going to sit there for the next 25, 30 years. Another thing, because you said you're a history nerd or buff, whatever word you use, I also am. And I got a history degree from Bradley just because I loved studying history so much, and I realized I could get a double major I wouldn't have to stay any longer. So I love history also. And if you really study American history, this gets back to the Electoral College, you realize that essentially almost every decision in terms of statehood from, go back to whatever, 1776 to the Constitution and all that, to the Civil War, you will realize that how we determined states and allowed them into the Union, almost 100% had to do with the free state versus slave state debate, right? And keeping that fair, right? So that you would only allow in, okay, a couple states here, free states, couple states there. You got the Missouri Compromise. And I bring that all up because it is hilarious. When I say hilarious, I mean, obviously, everything going back to the day was terrible and awful with what happened in terms of slavery. But we essentially still use the same system, which is the Electoral College, which for the most part, for the first 100 or so years, was solely based on the slavery argument. I mean,
Right.
look this up, folks. Don't just take my word for it. Look up how states were put into the Union from about, I don't know, 1800 to 1860s when we had the Civil War. Slavery was the number one issue for statehood.
Yep.
That's how we carved up this country, and that's how we're determining elections in 2024. It's almost as stupid as Omaha, Nebraska being able to settle the goddamn election. It makes no sense. It's laughable until I actually say it in my brain.
Right.
And then I realize how stupid it is.
It's crazy to think about, but especially when you understand the history of not only slavery, as you talked about, but also the other big thing they had to do was they had to appease the small states. Yeah. And to get them in the Union, the small states were like, we're not going with strict proportional representation because we're smaller. We want power. So that's why they came up with the Senate. That, of course, is why they came up with the Electoral College. It was to balance that power. Just imagine you were starting from scratch now. Imagine like you had no history, right? So there was no history of the Electoral College, and America just formed tomorrow, right? And all these people came together and they're like, okay, how are we going to pick the most important job, the presidency, for 330 million people? And somebody was like, well, most votes wins, right? That's democracy. And someone else was like, no, I have an idea. Have you ever heard? I'm going to call it the Electoral College. Hear me out for a second. And then you spent the next 30 minutes explaining it again. And you put that up against, I don't know, most votes wins, which is, again, literally how we pick every other office in our country of any kind of importance. It just is so crazy. And the people make the arguments. Again, it's why you talk about the Supreme Court. They make the arguments based on, does it help me and my party and my team right now? And if the answer to that is yes, then I support it. And if the answer to that is no, then I oppose. And by the way, that goes for Democrats too. Because like I said, if Democrats were benefiting from the Electoral College, they would probably be making the same arguments Republicans are making now. They would just reverse. If Democrats had right now there's a 6-3 Republican conservative majority on the Supreme Court that's locked in for a while. If that were reversed and it were a 6-3 liberal majority, you would have Democrats saying, oh, you can't mess with the sacred institution of the Supreme Court that our country figured out over so many years, the delegate balance, and Republicans would be the one probably calling for Supreme Court reform. So both sides have their share of hypocrites. I get it. I understand it, but I'm just saying step back from a moment and just think, okay, remove my personal preferences from the equation. And just imagine I were trying to design the fairest, most equitable system I could that would lead to the cleanest, easiest transition of power. What would it be? And of course it would be the popular vote. I mean, come on.
Okay, I only bring this up because you mentioned the 3/5 compromise. I have chuckled at this for years because, again, I put myself, think about this, Eric. So this was 1787, Constitutional Convention. A bunch of dudes with wooden teeth, with white wigs, wearing high socks,
and
sat
makeup
in a room, makeup. They were probably drinking whiskey out of a barrel. And these men argued whether essentially a black person, a slave, should be worth 3/5 of a human being. And I bring this up. This is like, when I say comedy, this is like the Dave Chappelle racial draft comedy. Think about this. There's probably half the dudes in the room were like, no, it should be 2/5. And the other half were like, no, it should be 4/5, right? Like, just imagine the argument. Like, Eric, I know I'm trying to be kind of funny, but that was a debate. Like, no, they're only 40%. No, they're 80%. Let's compromise on 60%. That was basically an argument being had by these dudes with powdered wigs, makeup, and high socks, wooden teeth in the late 1700s, and we're still
Yeah,
basing a lot of the crap we do now on it. It's insanity.
it is. And again, I have tremendous respect and admiration for most of the founding fathers, particularly Hamilton and Madison and Washington and Adams, Jefferson. They were men of their time, right? They, like we all are. They were products of where they grew up, what was going on around them, and they were trying to do the best they could. And I think given those constraints and given what we were up against to try to form this country, they overcame incredible odds. And what they came up with was a blueprint that I think it speaks for itself what America's become over 250 years. They should be held up in high regard for that. But to get there, they had to do and make some pretty terrible compromise. I mean, essentially think with the Southern, because look, the Southern states were essentially arguing at the Constitutional Convention, slaves aren't people, they're property. They don't have any rights at all. None, not the least of which is the right to vote. They have no rights. But we want them to count because we want more representation in Congress. And the Northern people were like, well, we don't really like slavery. We don't think you should own people, but they certainly shouldn't be allowed to vote. And they shouldn't be counted because that for congressional representation because they're property. Like these were the arguments they were having at that time. And those arguments and the deals that were made, some of which have stood the test of time and I think been proven to be pretty good. Others have not, right? Like not direct electing senators, the Electoral College, but trying to get rid of them now because of the way that it benefits or hurts one party is never going to happen. Let's be honest. It's not going to happen.
Okay, we'll wrap up here. We got the debate. I also want to talk about the Harris Walz interview last week, which was the night that we recorded last week. So debate, first of all, I mean, I can't wait for the debate. I said the same thing about the Joe Biden debate. Never did I think it was going to start in motion Joe Biden stepping down, although I'm glad it happened. But what do you think of this debate? I mean, I'm excited for it. I don't know if we're going to get a ton of fireworks. I don't know how much it matters. I guess it matters a lot, in my opinion, for Kamala Harris, right? We've seen Trump debate. Trump also does a million interviews. He does a million podcasts, which he should get credit for. And Kamala Harris should do more interviews. And like I said, we'll discuss her CNN interview last week. But look, this is the big time. If you remember Kamala Harris and her debates in 2019, 2020, whenever it was, I remember two moments. Okay, one good, one bad. I remember the good moment where she said whatever to Joe Biden. I was that little girl. Remember that? Oh, and then also,
Yep.
didn't she call Biden racist or something? Anyway, whatever. I remember that. I remember Tulsi Gabbard getting after a little bit. And then obviously people on the right play that clip all the time and are like, Tulsi Gabbard destroyed Kamala Harris, which it was a nice moment. I didn't think it was like the greatest thing ever, but whatever. Look, this is now the big time. You are running for president. So even though that debate back in the day, that was important, like this is her first time to come out there and really show she can go toe to toe with Trump. So to me, it matters more, way more for Kamala Harris. Trump can go up there and say whatever the hell he wants, but if he gets a couple good quotes, people are going to say he won. But I think there's a lot on the line for Harris now that I think it through.
Yeah, I am not going to make a prediction because I predicted Biden would do well in the first debate. I thought he could hold it together for a night. He had like those 10 days of Camp David. I thought, he'll be fine and that will be a win, right? Because people had such low expectations. Obviously, I was wrong. So I will not make a prediction. What I will say is I think I initially liked the idea of the muted mic because of what a shit show the 2020 debates were with the constant interruptions, mainly by Trump, but by Biden too to some degree. But then in practice, it was one of those things where it sounded great in theory. Once I saw it, it led to what would have been, if Biden was just okay, it would have been such a boring debate. There would have been almost no back and forth because when you mute the mics, you eliminate the back and forth. And again, I hate the constant interruption. But I also hate that just I'll answer, then I'll be done, then you'll answer, because a debate should be back and forth. Those are the moments. That's where you learn something. I love the idea of the muted mic when I heard it, but then when I saw it in practice, I don't like it at all. I think it benefits Trump. Even though he didn't want it, I think it really benefited him in that first debate. And I think it will probably benefit him again because it forces him to rein in his worst impulses, which are to constantly interrupt, to potentially say something that is inappropriate or that he shouldn't say because he's fired up in the heat of the moment. Now, if he does that, you won't hear him because it's muted when he's not giving his answer. So I think it helps Trump. In terms of strategy, I think you're right. We have not seen Harris. She's not done a ton of interviews, and she's only done the one big one, and then I think a radio one. She's laid out some policy, but American people are still learning about her. They know who she is, but they don't really know her. This will be the biggest audience she's ever had, bigger than, her acceptance speech at the DNC. Tens of millions of people will watch it live. Millions more will see the clips. So this is huge for her. I mean, absolutely. Trump, we know what he's probably going to do. It's the same thing he usually does. Hammer immigration, inflation, say a lot of things that are not true or really misleading, ramble, at times incoherently. That's kind of what he is. People expect that. That's the bar for him. We don't really know what the bar is for Harris. It could be bad. It could be really good. Who knows? So I think Harris, obviously, she's got to lay out some policy. I think for her side, you have to fact check Trump to some degree. You can't depend on the moderators to do it. That's not really their job. You can't try to go piece by piece. And I hate to use the word lie because lying implies you're intentionally doing it. And I don't know if Trump is or if he actually believes the things he says. But he says a lot of things that are not true or are grossly misleading constantly. You can't try to correct everyone in real time. But here's what you can do. If you follow Trump and you listen to his speeches or you've watched him in the debate or you've seen the fact checks, many of his misstatements are the same thing over and over again, some variation of them, right? Crime was lower when I was president. Not true. Things like that. Black unemployment was lower when I was president than under Biden. Not true. I lowered prescription drug prices, forced the negotiations. Not true, or misleading, I should say. Those things he says over and over again. You should be ready for those if you're Harris. You should have short, crisp beatdowns of him when he says that. Something like, there he goes again. Let me tell you why that isn't true. Here he goes again lying. Here's the actual facts. Have it ready to quickly correct him and then pivot to what you would do and the differences in policies. That's what a skilled debater does against Trump. You don't try to fact check everything he says. You'd be there all night. You'd have no time. But he says some of the same misstatements over and over again. Be ready. For Trump, I think it's very simple. Act presidential. For God's sake, don't say anything about her race. Don't say anything about her being a woman. Don't make
black.
fun of. Yes. Don't talk about it. Don't even say the word black in any context. Avoid that word like the plague. Don't make fun of her laugh. Don't make it personal. Don't call her stupid. If he can manage to avoid personal insults, if he can look presidential, it would be nice if he showed some command of the issues, but that ship has long ago sailed. Hit your basic points. Hope people don't remember what happened in 2020 with COVID, and just hit your basic points of pre-COVID. The economy was strong. We were at peace in the world. Let's go back to that time, right? Don't worry. Don't get into the weeds or context of anything, and just kind of hit those broad themes. And that if Trump does that, and can stay out of any kind of, if he can avoid being baited into some type of insult, I think that would be a win for Trump.
She was always Indian, then she turned black. The way he says
Right.
black. My wife and I were laughing nonstop the other night because he's like, black. Okay. Couple things I agree with you on the mic. I think it's good for both. Here's why. And you've heard this, that the whole reason Kamala wants the mics open so she can do the same thing she did to Pence. I'm speaking. It's my turn to talk, which isn't nice. Look, that's a good way. I think women like that because let's be real. A lot of women are talked over in the world. They're mansplained. Yes. So I do think that's a good moment when Trump starts rambling. Kamala, it's my turn. It's my turn, Donald. It's my turn to speak. But then on the other side, see, you said that it takes away Trump's worst impulses. Off the top of my head, I can remember some good lines, though, against Hillary. Remember there was one where she said something and he perfectly interjected, like, yeah, you'd be in prison. Remember it was something like that? That was really good.
Yes.
There was another
Yeah.
one, I think it was the town hall where he kept stalking her. Remember he's like walking behind her, stalking her
Yes.
the whole time, which was so awkward, but also hilarious for entertainment and television. She said something about Abraham Lincoln, I believe. And he's like, oh, oh, you're Abraham Lincoln now, or you're no Abraham Lincoln. I can't remember the exact line. Folks, look it up. But I do think because Trump is funny, like him
Which
or
is
not,
which is funny, by the way, because Trump says he's the person who's done more for black people than any president
sure.
since Lincoln.
Whether you like Trump or not, he's funny. He has some good lines. And I think he has the ability with the mics open to jump in there and interject with some good little one-liners. Let's end on the interview from last week. I remember after the convention, you said that Kamala Harris had an extra base hit. And we were joking, is it a double? Is it triple? It wasn't a home run. It was certainly better than a single. Watching that interview, which wasn't very long, by the way. I mean, if you look, the content had to be less than 30 minutes. I mean, they made it an hour with a bunch of teases and Dana Bash, introing every segment. But I thought it was either a single or like a dribbler double down the line. It wasn't bad. It wasn't great. I think for all the buildup of, hey, you never do an interview, I think maybe it should have been longer. Again, I don't know if it moved the needle. She had to do it. She has to start doing more of those. So it is important. But I was kind of excited to watch that. And then after watching it, I'm like, okay, it was okay. Like I said, I think it was net neutral. Like I don't think it was
Yeah.
advantage Harris or Trump, but she had to do it and she needs to do more.
Well, I think I think it was a win for Harris, and the reason was it was fine. As you
Sure.
said, it was a single. It was normal. It was a
Yes.
normal, typical, somewhat boring political interview. And the Trump people had built it up to be like, oh, she can't even do it. She'll make a giant gaffe, which, to be fair, she had done in some interviews years ago, but she didn't. There was no gaffe. There was some command of policy. There was, some broad talk of flowery language that you expect from a politician. And it was just kind of your normal politician interview, which is why I think it's a mistake by the Harris campaign. Look, I think Harris and her campaign overall have done well, but I have, again, two major qualms with them. The first is not picking Shapiro, which I think could be a big mistake. We'll see. But the second is, although I do want to give him some grace for that, because there is some reporting that I just want to say this, that Shapiro maybe was demanding some things that a vice president usually doesn't get to demand. So I'm not entirely sure that was a one-way street of Harris rejecting Shapiro. I think that may have been like a joint breakup. When people say it was a mutual breakup, like who broke up with who, like and usually they're lying when they say that. It was usually, but this may have been the true like
Not when
joint
I said
breakup.
it. I was being
Yeah,
serious.
right. You were
It's
being
not
serious.
you, it's me. No, it's not you, it's us. It's
It's
us.
us, right?
It's Shapiro and Harris.
So that may not have been a mistake. That may have been just what it was going to be. But I do think the mistake they made was I don't mind they waited a while to do the interview. I think that makes sense given that she was thrown in at the last minute. But once you started, have a bunch, have
Mhm.
like 3 or 4 over the span of a week. And the reason I say that is because A, you get the exposure. The first one would have been covered more. I mean, the Dana Bash interview, that was a big story on other networks. Other
Yeah.
networks were covering that like a big event. You would have gotten a lot of play with a couple more big interviews following that up. And also, it would have given you some practice for a debate. It's not the same thing as a debate, obviously. Trump's not there, but you get some potentially tough questions like, hey, why did you support fracking and now or not support fracking and now you do? Why did you call for universal health care? Is that still your position, Medicare for all? Do you still think ICE should be abolished? Do you still favor defunding the police? What are your policy positions? Let's get into the details. That back and forth for Harris would have been good for her. Now, look, she'll do that this week. She's going to Pittsburgh. We're recording this on Thursday, and she's staying in Western Pennsylvania, I believe, all the way through the debate to prep, kind of like a Biden at Camp David situation. So I'm sure they'll be doing a lot of mock. I don't know. Hopefully it works out better.
Hopefully better.
I'm sure they'll be doing a ton of mock, asking her all of those questions, having answers ready. I get that. But that's all behind closed doors. The lights aren't on, Charlie. You know this is covering sports for a long time, playing sports. There's a big difference between what you do in practice and what you do when the crowd is there and the lights are on. And for a politician, practice is great, but that's simulating. Okay, I know that this interview is going to be seen by people. Like, I know the lights are on, I'm mic'd up. Having that feeling and answering those questions, and Harris has done a lot of that in her life, but not recently. And having that back and forth, I think really could have helped her for the debate. I think it would have been really good for her to have some of those reps leading into the debate. And I think it's a mistake for her campaign for that reason. It's not so much the reason of, oh, she has to do it, I want to see her. It's more of, let's get her that practice heading into the debate. If she doesn't have a good night, and maybe she will, but if she doesn't have a good night, I think that could be one of the reasons why. Not enough reps.
We're talking about practice, not a game, not the debate, practice. All right, let's end on that. Great show, sir. We got to get this out as soon as possible. Thank you, everybody, for watching, listening, comment, like, subscribe, rate the show on podcast, and tell everybody about it. Put it in your group text, put it on social media. Let's keep this thing going. We've had a good week here on Everybody Settle Down, and let's keep it going all the way through this election. That's Eric Messersmith. I'm Charlie Marlow. Thank you, sir. We'll see you next week. And folks, we'll do one either the night of or right after the debate next week. So check that out. See ya.